Good evening to everybody, wherever we are in the world. Greetings from Manila. So I'm in Manila, as JP introduced, and I'm just going to share my screen. So firstly, disclaimer, the first thing I'll say is that I'm not an expert on SDG 11. I have had quite a bit of experience working with children in street situations. And so I will try and give some insight into how I think SDG 11 intersects with the needs and issues facing children in street situations. But given that it's a very short time frame, I'm not going to try and go into too much detail. But hopefully you'll have an oversight into the main issues. Okay, so just a very, very brief introduction to who we are. So I'm the Executive Director of Bahay Tuluyan. We have been working with CISS, is our acronym for Children in Street Situations, since 1987. We served as the Civil Society Chair for the Subcommittee for the Protection and Welfare of Children in Street Situations from 2018 to 2023. And as that co-chair of that committee, we helped to lead the development of the Philippines' first national multi-sectoral strategic plan for children in street situations. So this is a rights-based approach to trying to address the needs and issues of children in street situations. And Bahay Tuluyan, as JP mentioned, is a member of the Consortium for Street Children, which is an international network of organisations and interested individuals working on this issue. So there's more information at our website. But just to get straight into the concern, or I guess the topic for today, trying to understand the intersection. So the goal of SDG 11 is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So I guess what we're trying to understand is, where do street children fit into this image of inclusive, resilient, safe, sustainable cities? So before we jump into that, I think it's important for us to understand who are children in street situations. And the definitions you can see here come from the general comment, UNCRC General Comment 21, which defines basically two groups of children. The first is children who depend on the streets to live and or work, whether alone, with peers, or with family. And secondly, a wider population of children who've formed strong connections with public spaces and for whom the street plays a vital role in their everyday lives and identities. So it's quite a diverse group. So we're not just talking about children who live on the street full time. We're not just talking about unaccompanied children. We're talking about families. We're talking about children for whom the street is their main go-to place, or the place where they spend their recreation time or their working time, or it's a very important part of their life and identity. And so I guess one of the overall statements that I'll make is that not achieving SDG 11 both pushes and pulls children onto the street. So basically, when we talk about CISS, we normally talk about the different push and pull factors in place. So the push factors can be and will continue to be, unless we address them, inadequate housing, lack of access to basic services, natural disasters, abuse and violence, and unemployment. And then pull factors that are drawing children onto the street are economic opportunities, places to play, sleep and breathe, and connectedness, or a sense of community with their peers and other members of the community. So I think keeping in mind these push and pull factors is really important as we look. There's not one type of street child, or there's not one situation. So it's a very non-homogeneous group of children with varying forms of connection and needs on the street. So I guess basically what I'd like to share with you is what I see as the two main issues. The first is invisibility. So invisibility for children in street situations. And this is where they will fall through the cracks in SDG 11 unless we really make concerted efforts to make sure they don't. So there are different aspects of this invisibility. First is that at an individual level, CISS are not recognised by their local authorities. So this is, in the Philippines, often called dayuhan. So when we approach the local authorities for registration cards or documentation of different kinds, that's the local governments will say they're not from here, so they won't be recognised by their local authorities. Secondly, at a structural level, there is confusion over who is responsible for children in street situations. Are they a parking issue? Are they a law and order issue? Should it be the police? Should it be the social welfare department? And what we've really found in our work across this sector is that there is a lack of confusion. There is a lack of clarity in whose mandate it is to deal with these children. And that often means they fall through the cracks. And then thirdly, at a policy level, children in street situation are often overlooked. They don't necessarily fit into the more well-defined, well-recognised groups like children with disabilities, or in terms of gender frameworks. So children in street situations generally cross a whole lot of different sectors, and so they're not often included as a particular group that needs to be targeted. So that's what I would define as the first issue, the issue of invisibility. And then interestingly, the second issue that I would define is the issue of visibility. So the issue of visibility in relation to children in street situations is that their actual visibility on the street is often what triggers us. It's often what triggers people to make a response in the first place. And that can often lead to more harm for these children. So in different ways. So first, there can be what we tend to term the welfare approach. So the visibility of children on the street prompts a response in us of wanting to help these children, of wanting to do something, of wanting to remove them from the dangers on the street, which is not always a bad thing, but it can be implemented in ways that are detrimental to children. More often, to be negative is what we would call a repressive approach. So the sight of children on the street is perceived as a threat, a blemish on society, something that needs to be removed to be cleaned up. So in thinking back to SDG 11 and our ideas of safe, inclusive, resilient cities, if there are visible children on the street that don't conform with our society norms of what children should children should be doing, then that can cause conflict. And then that links with the third point, that children in street situations do not necessarily fit our vision of an ideal childhood. So this impacts on our willingness to incorporate them and their needs into public spaces. So I think that one of the risks when we talk about goals and we envision a bright future is that it's hard for us to incorporate into that ideas that don't fit into our ideas of an ideal world. And the reality with children in street situations, we're not conceding to the fact that there always will be children in street situations, but the reality is that in most cities around the world there are. And so it is important that as we plan for our cities, that we make sure that these children still have space in the cities, so that not the only default option is not always just to remove them. So that's, I guess, the two overarching issues that I think overarch and underlie they intersect between CISS and SDG 11. So just to give you, I guess, a more concrete example, or a couple of more concrete examples, I've just got two very short case studies that I want to share with you. So the first is in relation to 11.1, the target that JP mentioned earlier, which is that by 2030, there should be access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. So it's fairly non-controversial. It makes a lot of sense. In trying to understand how this fits or relates to children in street situations, the connection is very clear. Inadequate or unaffordable housing is a key push factor, pushing children in street situations into those situations, pushing children into street situations. And once in those situations, or once children don't have adequate housing, once they become homeless, they are vulnerable to many other abuses and violations. So the impact is significant. Street children and families are often not in houses on a regular basis. So they don't get recognised for rehousing, for basic services. Yeah, I'll give you an example in a moment, but often our programs like in the indicators that were mentioned earlier, you can see that they're linked to improving the housing of people who already have houses. But if you don't actually have a house to begin with, you're often not even recognised. And even more so for children who aren't connected to families. So unaccompanied children are very unlikely to be eligible for a government housing program. They might be eligible to be sheltered in a government shelter, but that doesn't provide them long-term housing solutions necessarily. And then even the UN definition of a slum doesn't normally include sidewalk dwelling, living in cemeteries, living in markets or plazas or under bridges. So there is really this whole sector of people who live, who are homeless or with insecure housing, who don't even fall into the programs aimed to capture them. So to give you that example of that, in the Philippines, the conditional cash transfer program aimed to target the poorest of the poor. And it did this through a household survey. So you can imagine how implicit in the idea of a household survey is the idea that street dwellers are automatically excluded because they don't live in households. So what happened then in the Philippines was that was eventually recognized by the government, and what evolved was the modified conditional cash transfer program for homeless street families. But you could see in the very first round of all the planning that went into the original program, homeless people weren't even considered, even though the program itself was aiming to target the poorest of the poor. And then I guess what some of the drawbacks of that program, that when it was eventually modified to meet the needs of the homeless population, there was limited interventions for this group. For example, they were given rental assistance, but for short periods of time. There was difficulties with tracking or supporting families over time. Many of the street families had difficulty with meeting the social inclusion burdens. So, for example, being able to secure the appropriate legal documents or bank accounts to be able to access the government support. And then often the risk of removal of benefits if the children were on the street. So this is also a risk for children and families under this program. So an imperfect solution. And I guess the idea here being that you can really see the invisibility issue. So just to show you some of the ways that the Philippine National Strategic Plan for CISS is aiming to address some of these issues. Firstly, to provide children on the street with informal identity cards so that they can overcome some of the barriers, the documentary barriers for accessing services. Improving access to civil registration, for example, getting birth certificates for children who are unregistered. And finally, the government has agreed to conduct a comprehensive review of existing housing and relocation policies to include children in street situations and their families in the priority sectors. So this for us is really important, that they can actually be factored into that kind of housing program. Okay, and then I'll just very briefly share with you one more case study, which relates to target 11.4. Strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage, which is obviously a really important goal, a really important target, but has impact also on children in street situations. So the connection is that often those places that we're trying to protect are also the pull factors for CISS, for children in street situations. Sites of cultural heritage are tourist sites, and so children in need are attracted to those areas because of the economic opportunities. And so the impact of fulfilling this goal of protecting and safeguarding is that often this pushes children in street situations out. So once the area is beautified and it becomes a draw card for tourists, for visitors, then the presence of children in street situations becomes less and less desirable for many members of the community, and they get pushed out. And then what can also happen, either separately or at the same time, is that these spaces can become semi-privatized, even public spaces. So this can really lead to a kind of indirect discrimination where, for example, here in Manila, some of the biggest tourist attractions are often malls, and malls are private property, but they're semi-private in terms of they're really open to most people of the public most of the time. But through things like dress codes and security guards, children in street situations can continue to be excluded from those places, even without formal discriminatory policies in place. So just one example I wanted to give you, which is very local to us here at Bahay Tuluyan, is the example of Paraiso ng Batang Manila, a playground that was a very small playground, but it was a really important playground for children here in our area, very run down, very dilapidated. And what the government decided to do was to convert part of it into a children's road safety park, which sounds like a great idea, you know, good for children to be able to access. But what happened as they built the road safety park, they put up high fences with barbed wire, and they said that it was no longer available just for open access, but you had to secure a permit from the relevant government authority before you can access the park. So basically what happened was that the children no longer had, and not just children in street situations, but also every child in the area no longer had anywhere to go, and they still don't. And so that pushes them out of those public spaces. So what I was talking about is this de facto, sorry, there's a typo, privatization of public spaces through things like permits, guards, entrance fees, fences, and dress codes. And that's something I think we need to be very aware of as we try to move forward with the implementation of SDG 11. Just one more example is Luneta Park, which is a big park here in Manila. It's the biggest in the city of Manila. Same thing happens. It's open to the public, but you know, we have direct personal experience of being excluded from that when by security guards, private security guards, who perceive that the children in street situations are not a good fit for the public space. And obviously public green spaces in very densely populated cities like Manila are very, very important. So again, under the National Strategic Plan for Children in Street Situations, there are some attempts to remove some of the stigma, to make sure that children don't experience this kind of discrimination, and that the national parks and development committees are oriented to make sure that they make these public spaces available for children in street situations. So I guess the summary and what I'd like to I guess end with is that if we want to really effectively implement SDG 11, we need to make sure that we address both the issues of visibility and invisibility of children in street situations. Thank you very much.